Book discussion, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, 1932. I want to contrast Huxley's book with 1984 by Orwell. The books were written about 15 years apart. Orwell's book, 1948. They're both utopian or dystopian novels or fables about the future from the vantage point of the authors. And the question is, how did Huxley see the future? Was he right? Was he on point? What are the lessons we can learn? How does it contrast to Orwell? And the answer to this question is none of the books actually captures our reality, because as real as they are in many points, in particular Huxley's book, they neglect the power of creativity, the power of knowledge creation that David Deutsch describes in the beginning of Infinity. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's February 12th, 2021. This is Krim Delko. For the day, the fund is up 60 basis points. The market's up 40 basis points. We are up 21.3% for the year. The market's up 4.7%. We're outperforming by about 16.5%. Aldous Huxley in Brave New World describes a utopian world, a dystopian world, a very depressing world in which people are all conditioned to be happy. People are conditioned to believe in certain things that the government or whoever rules this society wants them to believe in. There's the Ministry of Emotional Engineering, there's the Ministry of Conditioning, there is the Headmaster of Conditioning. People are conditioned to believe in consumption, to believe in happiness, to believe in promiscuity, and people are conditioned to completely neglect their sort of primal feelings, primal urges. All these things are being neglected, other than, of course, sex. Sex is like I said, it's promiscuity, and the reproduction of the species happens through fertilization clinics. And there is no love, there is no mother and father, none of that. Huxley uses Henry Ford or Ford as a metaphor for industrial progress, for the future, for the longing of humans to subdue technology and nature for their own purpose. Huxley rightly forecasts a consumption society, a society that is obsessed with material possessions, and a society that is increasingly detached from nature. Bugs, things like that are killed. There's no bugs, there's no diseases, and for whatever disease that we don't have a cure, there is soma. Soma is a drug, kind of something that we would take today in terms of Xanax or opioids and things like that. So he foresees a lot of things that are happening today. And most importantly, I think he foresees a culture of addiction, which I think is propelled through social media and the ability to deliver opioid function in the brain through digital media. This is something that particularly Facebook is using, Twitter to some extent. All the other social media platforms are either consciously or subconsciously taking advantage of this fact. So we are living in a dystopian world of instant gratification, no foresight, no thinking forward, consumption. We are promiscuous. We have serial polygamy, or sometimes even polygamy anyway, or we don't call it that way. So there's a lot of things that Aldous Huxley is actually forecasting, and there is this sense that, oh my gosh, while you're reading this book, you're realizing this is our society. You know, we have an opioid crisis. We're all addicted to our phones and the opioids, and there is very little we can do about it. Now, Huxley, in a talk that he gave at Berkeley in 1962, 1 year before his death, a very interesting talk called The Ultimate Revolution, talks about his ideas of totalitarian regimes and revolutions, and he explains what he was trying to capture in Brave New World, which is a revolution where the individual is subdued without the individual even feeling being subdued. The difference, and here is the first big difference between Huxley and Orwell, is in Orwell's book, there is a totalitarian regime that uses force, coercion, torture, suffering to force people to think in a certain way. So the people know that they are being coerced, but they don't have a choice. And the brutality of the regime brings them to the brink of giving up their own self and believing in whatever the party is saying. There is this famous scene in the book where the person asks the protagonist, what is 2 and 2? The protagonist says 4, and then he gets tortured until he admits that, well, it's 5 or 3 or whatever you want me to say, just stop torturing me. In Huxley's book, that's not the case. In Huxley's book, and Huxley in his 1962 lecture talks about this, he explains that the ultimate revolution is the revolution where we are so coerced, we are conditioned without feeling conditioned. And he says we can, this can be done through suggestions, verbal suggestions. This can be done through drugs. This can be done through just behavioral conditioning. And the fact that, for example, in Huxley's book, the ruling whatever party absolutely wants to avoid people being alone, and you always have to be sort of in a society of people, because being alone is dangerous. You might start thinking for yourself, and that is not tolerated in that society. It's very similar in Orwell's book, where you're also not supposed to be alone, but there it's a little bit different in a sense that the party is dictating very precisely what you actually are supposed to think and how you're supposed to talk. And if you dare to think differently, you get punished or you get undone. You become a non-person. And in Huxley's book, there is this, I think, utopian belief that the society can be happy and people can be coerced. Now, there is also the slogan, ending is better than mending. So if you cannot be fixed, then you'll be ended. You'll be put somewhere. And now here's what I want to do here. I want to discuss a little bit more what are the main points that I'm taking away from Huxley's book, how does it contrast to Orwell, and then I want to bring my conclusion here that both books are actually not very good representations of our society today, that I would say we have a much more optimistic society because we have progress, because we have knowledge creation and creativity, and because we have people like David Deutsch and his book The Beginning of Infinity, which underline the quest of humankind to create knowledge, and even knowledge, in a sense, knowledge about these things, about what Orwell wrote and about what Huxley wrote. That knowledge helped us to prevent these things from happening. So those books, as good as they are, as important as they are, they were a milestone for the authors to be wrong. Because of the knowledge that we had through those books, and also, of course, Solzhenitsyn's book, which I think is one of the most important books written in the 20th century, because those books were written and we realized in black and white what those totalitarian dystopian regimes can represent, we created knowledge to prevent them. So let's start with Huxley first. There's 3 main points I want to take across. Number one, in Huxley's book, the society is a dystopian society that is completely materialistic, that is absolutely neglecting any kind of tribal, primal feelings, none of that. There is the character of the savage, which incorporates all these things. So there are still people in an Indian reservation in New Mexico that have these tribal instincts, but the civilization, as Huxley calls it, that society which is civilized doesn't have those things anymore. The society is completely based on instant gratification, on things like, well, he doesn't call it opioids, but we will call it opioid today. So whenever, and this is my second point, whenever something goes wrong, we take a drug, we take soma in the case of Huxley, and we just forget about it. And third, there is really uh, there is uh, there is no way to escape this society, and the society is as a whole forcing individuals to behave in that way. The end of the book is such that the protagonist who wants to fight this, who wants to swim against the stream, gives up. He's not coerced, he is not killed or anything or put in a concentration camp. He simply gives up because he can't swim against the stream. The stream is too strong. Now, in Orwell's book, things are very different. The 3 points in Orwell's book are: number one, the regime is killing language. Language is the means by which we can have conversation and by which we can distribute knowledge, create knowledge, communicate knowledge. That is being systematically undermined. There's a famous scene in the book where the protagonist tries to preserve language and is being lectured by the regime that it is completely superfluous to have words, that language can be reduced to very few words, that, for example, the word good is enough, that we don't need the word bad, that we can just say I'm good, and we don't need words like excellent, we can just say good plus and good plus plus, and that slowly but surely we can get rid of all these words, because words and language are not serving any purpose in that totalitarian regime. Language as a means of communication is dangerous because language could foster thought crime. Thought crime, one of the words that Orwell uses, is a result of language. And if we put language in a prison, then start getting rid of words, or if we start clipping language of its power, if we start reducing language to its lowest common denominator, or the common denominator that the party tolerates, then thought crime is not possible. Orwell calls this newspeak. So language as a fundamental tool to control thought, and thought as a fundamental driving force for progress and creativity and freedom. And there, Orwell, I think, matches what Deutsch is saying, that is, creativity and knowledge creation depends on language, and Orwell kind of anticipates that and tries to kill it through his protagonists in the book. Number two, in Orwell's book, there is a clear desire to kill the past. If you don't have a history, then the present can be formed any which way you want. So killing the past, this is something that was very scary during the Trump times, and maybe even today could be still, I think, kind of lingering. It is also happening in Putin's Russia, where the past is being destroyed. Huxley, as a counterpoint here, doesn't necessarily care too much about the past. They talk about the past in the book, but they talk about it like as if they're those savages that used to get married and have kids, and there used to be something called a mother and a father, but all these things are gone. In a civilized society, we don't do these things anymore. So the past is not being erased in Huxley's society, the past is being erased in Orwell's society. And third and most important, in Orwell's book, the main slogan is power has only one purpose. Power serves power. There is no greater good. There is no purpose other than exercising power. This is the key insight that Orwell had. And I think to his criticism, people say, or critics of Orwell say, he didn't really anticipate 1984 in the book. He just described 1948 when he wrote the book. Why? Because this is exactly how the Stalinist regime in Russia was functioning. Exercise power for the sake of power. Exercise torture for the sake of torture with the higher purpose of exercising power. There is no such thing as a utopian desire to have a better world, to have more freedom, to be happy, any of that stuff. Even the Nazi regime under Hitler, even Lenin, and maybe in the beginning Stalin, they had some sort of utopian goals of creating a better society, at least for their people. In Orwell's 1984, the regime is simply there to exercise power. And I think this is the most powerful thing in this book that I want to take away, and that I think is kind of scarier than the Huxley. Both books are very scary. Both books describe a dystopian society that we want to avoid by all means. But Orwell's book is a lot more scary, because power for the sake of power is really what power is, and it has to be avoided by all means. And this is also what often reality looks like when we get to power. For example, just a little example here. We always talk about the power of the Fed to control the money supply and to control money in the economy. The power of the Fed is being exercised with the purpose of exercising power. There is no greater purpose. Nobody at the Fed intrinsically cares about a better economy or a better employment or any of that stuff. The only reason people exercise power, even in our democratic society, is because they are exercising power and they want more power. Power begets power. This applies to the Federal Reserve of the US, this applies to the European Central Bank, and to any other central bank in the world. So this is just one example. Of course, the same applies to police forces and military, and this is a fundamental thesis of the Austrian School of Economics, that in the end, every government's own sole purpose is to coerce people, to incarcerate people, or to take away what people have, resources from people. This is a very dystopian view. And now I want to get to my conclusion, which is that none of the two books, neither Huxley nor Orwell, actually predicted how our society developed, because we have the power of knowledge, we have the power of disruption within politics and the economics and the business to counteract these forces. And this is the optimistic view that I want to leave this episode with, that we have the ability to create knowledge. In fact, those two books were important knowledge, important milestones in the pursuit of progress and freedom. Freedom is the basic concept of exercising one's creativity, of developing thought, either in words, instantiating it in concepts and engineering practices and products and services, in political movements, in programs, in novels, in poetry, in music. This freedom is the fundamental building block of avoiding either Huxley or Orwell society. And both of them neglected those abilities. And I don't want to hold this against them, but in fact, they themselves were a product of a creative process, of a creative society that enabled them to write those types of books. And they should have seen that they are not some outlier, that they are part of an intrinsic mechanism that is called the beginning of infinity, a la David Deutsch. That is the ability of humans to develop knowledge, to develop creative, explanatory knowledge about certain things. In the case of Huxley, about the dystopian society that is driven by technology and consumption. In the case of Orwell, about a power-seeking totalitarian regime. In both cases, it's explanatory knowledge described in form of novels or fables and being put in front of us so we can learn from it and develop better solutions and better ways to deal with the risk of falling into such societies. I'm not saying that we are insured against these types of things. They can happen. And democracies are fragile. Democracy, in the Popperian view, is the ability to transition power from one to the other without violence. We've had issues like that in the US this year, that we almost risked that. Nevertheless, we're still here. We still have that ability. We still have those mechanisms in our society. We have, Huxley calls it the monopolistic dictatorship of science. I think academia in the Western world is on the verge of becoming a monopolistic dictatorship of science. The way academia works today has almost nothing to do anymore with the Popperian epistemology of replacing bad ideas with better ideas and things like that. Things like status, things like pedigree start matter more and more. So there is a lot of things that we need to be conscious about. But because we have Huxley and we have Orwell, we have two milestones, and there's obviously a lot more than has been written in the last 50, 60, 70 years that is reminding us of the necessity to keep the beginning of infinity going, to keep explanatory knowledge and creative knowledge creation at the heart of our process. And this is how I want to leave this. And I think our fund, Orange Capital Partners, is in the business of developing investments, creating investments, generating wealth through investing in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices with large impact. And we see ourselves as part of that progress, as part of that knowledge creation that is bringing society further away from those two utopian and dystopian realities. Thank you.